Sikkim 365 and Baylor Plus have teamed up to bring Baylor fans the ultimate content bundle. You can sign up now for $17.99 a month, a $5 monthly savings, and get instant access to all premium content on both websites. For more information, visit either sikkim365.com or baylorplus.com today. What's up, Baylor family? Welcome into Inside Baylor Sports, the official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. It's Tuesday, October 29th, and today, Grace and I will be previewing Baylor's next contest against the TCU Horned Frogs. TCU is now 5-3 on the season. It's coming off an exciting game against Texas Tech, where they trailed by as many as 17 points. Ultimately able to come back and win that game 35-34. And at this point, the last two games, TCU's just figuring out how to win games. And we know how important just winning games is. They are now 3-1 on the season in one-possession games. The only loss was to UCF, 35-34, in a game which they led, very similar but flipped to this game against Texas Tech that they just had. But they beat Stanford 34-27, one-possession game. Lost to UCF 35-34, as we just mentioned. Beat Utah in Utah 13-7, and then most recently 35-34 over Texas Tech. And I mean, that's kind of the name of their season right now, winning one possession games. The losses that they've haven't, I mean, the Houston game was kind of close, but truthfully, Houston just kind of controlled that game from start to finish. TCU had turnovers. This kind of plagued them the entire season, or they might have a much different outlook for this season. But now 5-3, Baylor 4-4. Baylor is currently 3-point favorites in this game at the time of this recording, and I think that is fair, all things considered. Now, if Texas Tech ends up winning that game, I'm curious where that line is because we know how public perception can impact it. But, man, this is TCU and Baylor have played some close games over the last 10 years, really, and I know that Baylor has struggled in a lot of those close games. They've only had one win over their last 10, with several blowouts included, but massive game. I don't think it can be understated for this particular team. Overstated, excuse me. Baylor has to figure out how to get this one done, but TCU presents problems like all teams, but they're a little bit different than what Baylor has faced over the last few games.
They definitely are. This is the team that's probably most similar to what Baylor saw against Colorado in that matchup that obviously, Baylor played pretty well for the most part, but gave up a Hail Mary, gave up another touchdown in overtime, and you end up losing that football game. So an opportunity to kind of get right, I guess, in a battle against a team that is very air raid heavy, very similar to what Baylor runs. They just don't run the football particularly well. They throw the ball very well, though, and they have a lot of weapons, which I know we're going to talk about. I think the thing that really stands out to me is, TCU went through their rough stretch, right? They lost 3 of 4 games, got routed by SMU. Really, I think they let that Central Florida game cost them a second game against SMU. They just kind of no-showed in that game. Bounced back, beat Kansas, and then again, kind of no-showed against Houston. So lost 3 of their 4 during that stretch, and then have been able to get right. Now, I would say they got right against a Utah team that is clearly reeling right now and is not the same team they were at the beginning of the year. And then a Texas Tech team that kind of just gave up that game towards the end. So I think that's kind of where I look at and go, man, the metrics really like TCU, but their wins haven't been very impressive. They haven't really faced the top teams in the Big 12. And then they've also gotten beat up pretty bad against the one good team they played all year, SMU. They got blown out against. The other teams on their schedule, you could argue, aren't very good. I think Tech will be a bowl team, but I mean, is there another team on here that's going to make a bowl game? I don't know. I think it's a real question. So I think that's kind of where I'm at with them at this current moment. Just kind of an overview of where their season has gone and kind of how they looked.
Yeah, so reality in this new unbalanced schedule is that teams play teams that other teams haven't faced. And so pulling statistics don't necessarily mean a lot. So you look, for instance, and I thought this was really interesting in TCU's defensive statistics, is that their pass defense has been pretty good. Like, it's not terrible, it's not great, but then you look at who they face that throw the football. They haven't faced the top passing teams in the Big 12 specifically. And you look back to Stanford, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like, you're talking about multiple teams in the outside of the top 100 national in terms of yards per games passing. That's not efficiency. That's just raw numbers, right? So it doesn't tell the whole story, but you look at Stanford, not a good passing team. You look at UCF, they might be able to throw the ball a little bit better, but they choose to run it a lot. SMU is actually, believe it or not, they're a really good rushing team. They're not a great passing team this year. Obviously, Texas Tech was the best passing team they played. They had quite a bit of success against TCU in that game before, especially considering that Baron Morton went out. So we don't really know. We know about TCU and their playmakers on offense. Outside of that, you still have a lot of questions about who they are. So let's kind of dive into this. Let's start with the offense because we know so much about what they are going to do offensively. They don't run the football. They throw the football a lot. They've tried to manipulate, kind of create a rushing game with Savion Williams running this wildcat type of offense with them, direct snaps. And that's what put them up early against Tech. And then he had quite a bit of success in that in the last 2 games. But now it's been on tape for 2 weeks. Utah and now Texas Tech has faced it. And I don't know what Baylor will do against that specifically, but it's been on tape now a couple of times. They've shown that they're going to try to do it. So Baylor's going to have to commit to figuring out a way to stop it. Outside of that, they're turning the ball over a ton. I mean, it's not just throwing interceptions with Josh Hoover. It's fumbles. I mean, there's like every single game they have a critical fumble, and that's crazy. They're averaging more than 1 fumble loss per game on the season. They've lost 10 on the season. That's just mind-blowing, especially when you consider they're throwing interceptions too, and they don't run the football a lot. So to have 10 fumbles when you don't run the football a lot, it's just crazy to think about. Some of that's part of bad luck, but I would also put a lot of that on the ability to coach not turning the football over. Maybe they turn it on this week and they don't have any turnovers, but that's the way they've lost games this year on offense.
It absolutely is. And I mean, you kind of go through it and they have 4 games where they have at least 3 turnovers. Yeah. That's a lot of games. And at some point, I got asked this on our chat this morning, about the turnover problems, how they're fluky. And I agree with that a lot of the time. But once you're 8 games into a season, if you're in the bottom, I think they're in the bottom 5 in the nation in turnover margin. That's kind of who you are. That's in your DNA. And I think a lot of it is because they haven't been able to run the football. And I think a lot of it is you're putting so much pressure on Josh Hoover to just kind of not just win you games, but drive you down the field consistently, convert on long third downs. I mean, you're asking a lot of him in this passing attack. And I think their quality is there at receiver, and I think Hoover's a good quarterback, but I think there's a little bit too much on his plate, and it's causing those turnovers and those issues. You mentioned the run game. Them going to Savion Williams, I think, is really smart. They have not been able to run the football with their running backs. Cam Cook and Jeremy Payne, both pretty good recruits, like 4-star type guys. And I think good players, like when you watch them in the open field, you see the speed, you see some of the things that I think people got excited about. They just don't block very well for them. And also they're not very physical. And so you kind of put those two together and it's like, well, you're losing yards on some carries. It's kind of a waste of a down to hand the ball off. And so now you put Savion back there, you get an extra blocker, which I do think has helped them. And Baylor really hasn't faced that, a true situation where a team's going wildcat often. They've probably seen like wildcat maybe a couple times all year, and one of them, Ollie Gordon, threw the football. And so I think that's kind of the interesting chess match there is kind of how does Baylor react to that? We saw in 2018, TCU basically beat Baylor because they ran wildcat with Jalen Reagor, and he had that, like a 75-yard touchdown run or something like that. And Baylor can't allow that to happen, because if you do and you allow TCU to get some momentum running the ball, you're in trouble. Quick stat on that. TCU on the season, they're 5-3. In those 5 wins, they've ran for at least 100 yards in all 5 of those games. They do not have another game where they've rushed for over 100 yards. So 5-0 when they run for 100 yards, 0-3 when they don't. It's pretty, it's pretty substantial.
Yeah. And correlating with that, you look at their first 3 games of the season, 2 turnovers lost total in 3 games. Since then, 5, and starting with SMU, 5 turnovers, 3 turnovers, 4 turnovers, 1 against Utah, which was exactly the reason they won that game, including getting back to the rushing game. And then against Texas Tech, 3 turnovers. So in the last 5 games, they've had 16 turnovers. That is truly remarkable. And I think you mentioned the physicality of the team. I think that goes back to the Sonny Dykes. That's who he is. He's not, he's not going to commit to running the football in a physical style of way. Like that's just been him forever. And he did it at TCU in 2022, but that was on the heels of the Gary Patterson, Garrett Riley was there. Things have completely shifted. They're trying to get that back a little bit with Savion Williams, but to me, that's only going to take you so far. I'm not saying Baylor's going to shut it down entirely, but it's been on tape. They're going to be committed to doing it. And it's kind of at this point, kind of what jump started them to these 2 wins in a row. I'm really anxious to see what they come out with offensively in this game for TCU. Baylor has shown the ability to say, hey, if we're going to take your run game away, we can take it away. They just did it against Oklahoma State. They've done it in previous games this season. Against Texas Tech, they did it. And I would obviously by far say Texas Tech's a better rushing team than what TCU has done with Taj Brooks and what they're able to do. They did it to a great extent against Texas Tech. If you're going to play that way, I think favors Baylor in the terms of you're just going to drop back and pass. They're going to have to figure out how to get a running game. I just don't know if that's the way to do it this week with Savion Williams after trying to do it for 2 straight weeks and having some success for it, but at other times that you haven't had success.
I think one thing to keep in mind is, a lot of that was by design for Baylor. They were we're going to take away the run game and force the quarterback to beat you. I kind of think they're going to do things a little differently this week. I think they're going to commit less guys to the run and hope that they can hold up front, which they should be able to do. If they don't, that's a problem. You're going to have issues. If you're allowing TCU to run the football, you're going to have issues. But I do think there's going to be more of a focus on the pass game. I do think that there are going to be times where you need to drop more guys into coverage. Baylor just simply has to get better in the secondary. They do. They're not where they need to be. And when you look at what's coming in with this TCU team, this is one of the most dangerous passing attacks on Baylor's schedule. Aside from Colorado, I don't think there's another passing attack that makes you more scared than this one. I mean, they have 4 receivers who, if you had a list of 10 receivers, maybe 12 receivers in the Big 12, they might have 4 of them. I mean, it's been that good for them. It's somewhere in that range. Maybe it's 4 of the top 15, something along those lines. But when you look at Jack Besh and how good he's been, 825 yards, 7 touchdowns. That was a guy Baylor really wanted out of the transfer portal, and he has taken his game to a whole nother level this season. And then you look at Savion Williams, 436 yards, 5 touchdowns. JP Richardson, who of course was at Oklahoma State, has 420 yards. Doesn't have a touchdown, but does have a huge return in their win. Which win was that? Hit a huge return in one of their wins. You can go look it up. And then the other one's Eric McAllister, the Boise State transfer, who has 463 yards and 4 touchdowns. I mean, that's 4 guys that are really, really good. And they're going to attack you. They're going to try to create explosives. As Dave Randa said today in the press conference, he's like, they don't have many play calls for 4 yards. They're not trying to get 4 yards. They're trying to get 80 yards every time they drop back, every time they call a play. And that really, I think it's pretty evident in how they've played this year. They are trying to create those explosives. And while they aren't the most consistent and they do turn the ball over, they do have playmakers that can beat you in space and beat you in one-on-one matchups.
Yeah. So to put this in perspective, passing explosive play rate of plays of 20 yards versus what they're actually running play wise, they're second in the Big 12 in explosive passing plays at 11.72. And that's with throwing the ball a ton. Typically you throw the ball a ton and you have so many dinks and dunks that there's not that ability to create a ton. There is an ability, but your percentage is down. They're still hitting at a high percentage, rushing explosive plays at 13 or at number 13 in the Big 12. So it's low. Obviously, by comparison, they don't run it a ton. And then when they're running it, they're not having a lot of explosive plays. And a lot of those have come with Savion Williams in the last couple of games, getting 10-plus yard runs. And then you look at what Baylor's done offensively, and know this about TCU. Baylor's explosive play rate, 13 offensively. And then you look at defensively, rushing the ball, they're number 7, and that's climbing up. But it's just kind of a polar opposite of what we see in the Big 12. In a lot of ways, it is like Colorado, right? Like I think that's the fact that Baylor has played Colorado already is great practice for this particular game. And in so many ways, the difference to me, and we talked about this with Alan Bowman, is like the turnovers potential is so much higher. Shedeur Sanders doesn't throw a ton of turnovers, interceptions. They don't turn the ball over a lot, especially, now that they've been up in games, it feels like they've relaxed a little bit and there's been more turnovers from Colorado. But Baylor in this game has to be prepared to get turnovers because they're going to be available to have. There's interceptions, there's fumble recoveries, opportunities. Baylor opponents have only fumbled 4 times this year. 4, or against Power 5 opponents, 4. TCU is doing that almost every single game, at least 2 or 3 every single game, putting the ball on the ground and the other team's getting it. So you have to be ready to capitalize on those moments. And if you don't, I mean, you look at the Tech game, the reason Tech was up in that game is because of a strip sack inside their 5-yard line. They get the ball back and then they go on this run to get up. You have to be ready to take advantage of those moments. And they didn't do that against Alabama. They weren't ready to take advantage of it. Now, Mike Gundy schemed away from a lot of potential issues, but the opportunities they did have early in the game, they didn't take advantage of them. Obviously, Oklahoma State doesn't fumble the ball, but TCU is going to give you those opportunities more so than anybody else on the schedule.
Right. And I mean, this is one of those things, right? Baylor hasn't been forcing those fumbles. So, you know, what is something going to give there? I think that Baylor does need to force turnovers in this game. I think that's pretty apparent. When I was kind of going through, I got asked earlier today, you know, what do I think the spread would be if we knew TCU was going to have 0 turnovers in this game? And I was like, I think it'd probably be TCU -3 at least. Like if you told me they're going to have 0, and that's not equating how many does Baylor have. Like if Baylor matches and it's 0-0, you know, okay, maybe, but Baylor hasn't really been turnover prone. And so that's where it's kind of like they need the turnovers more than TCU does in my eyes. Like they're expecting the turnovers more than TCU is. And so I think that's a key. That's what TCU's done all year. I mean, if Baylor forces 3 turnovers, they're going to be in great shape to not just win, but to cover. But the question is, you know, are they able to get those? Is that in Baylor's DNA? Because so far this year, I'm not sure that we can say that it is at this very moment. A few other stats kind of on TCU. SP Plus has them as the number 27 offense in the country. That is really remarkable given how many times they've turned the ball over. That just gives you an idea of how explosive they are and just how they're able to kind of make up for it, honestly. They're 41st in third down conversion, solid rate there. A big number for them, though, and something that Baylor didn't get the last couple weeks in their matchups. TCU, only 9 sacks allowed. That's top 20 in the country. They're really solid in that area. They try to get the ball out of Josh Hoover's hands quickly. He's not the most mobile guy, but he does have a habit of not getting sacked. He does a pretty good job of getting out of the pocket, throwing the ball away, or forcing an error instead of, you know, getting sacked. And that's kind of been a big thing. And then they also don't allow tackles for loss, which is really surprising for a team that doesn't run the ball very well. They only allow 4.5 tackles for loss per game, which is 34th in the country. So again, they're not allowing a lot of negative plays. They're just not really moving anyone when they run the football. And then they're just trying to protect their quarterback at all costs because they know that in order for them to win games, they're going to have to throw the ball effectively. Those are just some other numbers, but I think they're important ones and really speak to just how one-dimensional I think this team truly is. And so can Baylor take advantage of that? That's kind of the biggest question here is, you know, TCU's strength is kind of going up against Baylor's weakness on defense. And so that's where you kind of look at and go, okay, well, you know, how's this going to be? Is one side going to step up? Is one side going to have a scheme to really take advantage of that? Or is the side that's been a little bit more proven this year going to have a lot of success?
Yeah. Going back to those explosive play numbers, I actually was reading off the wrong one. TCU is 4th in explosive play rate, passing rate in the Big 12. They're 14th in explosive rushing plays in the Big 12. That's 10-yard rushes, 20-yard passes for those trying to keep track. That's exactly who they look like on film. They don't run the ball a ton. And I do think it is a weakness. I go back, like even in the Tech game, like early in that game, they weren't giving up a ton of stuff over the top. The Colorado game, they weren't giving up that. If there is a slot receiver on that team, and maybe it's Jack Besh that's most comparable to Brennan Presley, but Brennan Presley is just so much of a different cat. Like that's a difficult matchup for Baylor's linebackers, for their nickelbacks, from the standpoint that he's just quick and shifty. That's not Jack Besh's game. He's quicker, but he's not like Brennan. There's not guys like Brennan Presley, right? Brennan Presley's done that for seems like 15 years. But in general, like I'm really curious to see what Dave Aranda does. I think you're right. They're going to back off the line of scrimmage. They're not going to be playing the run first. If they get a 10-yard run, Baylor's not going to be distraught about it. Like, and that's the approach you have to take in this game. Like, as a fan, TCU gets a 10-yard run with Savion Williams. It's not the end of the day because they're not going to do that over and over. And if they try to do it over and over and over, Baylor will make an adjustment and take it away. So it's early on. You might see it some. I'm just really curious if Josh Hoover can sit back and throw into windows. He has that ability, but how often and consistent can he do it without turning the ball over? Shedeur Sanders absolutely was able to do that. Baron Morton a little bit, but not as much as what Shedeur Sanders will be. Josh Hoover, to me, is a different level than Baron. He's not as good as Shedeur. Not very many people are. So I'm curious how that completely unfolds and throwing into those tight windows, because if they're trying to take deep shots, they don't want to go. They don't want to take the dump downs. They don't want to do that. That's not. They might scheme it into this game, but that's not what they want to do. Can Josh Hoover throw the ball downfield without turning it over? And then can Steve Linton, can Matt Jones, if they're bringing a +1, not necessarily a blitz, but a 4-man rush, who that fourth guy, can they get there and create a turnover or create a sack? And believe it or not, man, like you mentioned the game against Oklahoma State, Baylor had 3 sacks in that game. One of them was an intentional grounding that would have been a sack. They chased him out of the pocket one time and got him down. And I don't remember what the third one was, but they had 3. And Oklahoma State doesn't give up a ton. So maybe that's some good, potential there in those third and long situations that Baylor will be able to get home against Josh Hoover.
Well, you mentioned, can Josh Hoover throw, into these windows? If he throws like he did last year against Baylor, it is going to be a long day. He completed 83% of his passes for 412 yards and 2 touchdowns with 0 interceptions. TCU only ran for 100 yards in that game. Baylor took away the run game completely. They just had 0 answer for the pass game. TCU won 42-17 in that game. So a lot has to change. And the crazy part is a lot of that secondary that got torched in that game is the same secondary that they're going to see this year, just with a different scheme and obviously different players up front, which obviously should change things. And it's in Waco, but the last year's sample size was not a good one. Sonny Dykes they had a great game plan for it. I also think Baylor was kind of in a situation where you're wondering if they'd given up on the season and whatnot. But it is interesting to just bring up that comparison. It also speaks to how much Baylor has struggled against TCU, because TCU was fine last year. They weren't great. And Baylor just kind of laid an egg in that game. You mentioned, no one's like Brennan Presley. I get that to a certain extent. I would also say that if you're having trouble tackling Brennan Presley in the open field, you're probably going to struggle with Savion Williams in the open field. He is very elusive and very strong, and he will break tackles and he'll run for miles. Like he'll beat you down the field. He'll score touchdowns. JP Richardson, more of that slot, beat you across the middle. Not really going to take the top off the defense, but he's just open consistently across the middle. So that's kind of you put those two together, kind of have a Brennan Presley type player. Jack Besh, maybe not like that, but he's winning downfield, which was not thought to be like his biggest strong point. He's doing it consistently. Very good route runner, also built physically. Like he's not a little guy. He's going to break arm tackles and things like that. It's an extremely tough challenge in my eyes for this Baylor secondary. And that's the area I have the biggest concerns for sure. Yeah,
it is. But I think what Baylor did, and I use Brennan Presley as an example of matching up wise, Matt Jones better not be chasing TCU receivers all over the field. Like that schematically, I think that was a much different approach that Baylor will take against Oklahoma State than they did against TCU. And I go back to the Tech games, to an extent, they can run the ball better than TCU did, but the Colorado game specifically, in the way we're not going to get beat deep. Like if you're getting beat deep against TCU, you're playing right into their hands. You have to have that ability to take it away and either make them throw it short or run the football. And if Dave Aranda, it's just like the game plan against Oklahoma State. Dave Aranda can't go in this game thinking he can take everything away. He has to go and say, okay, what are we going to, you can't beat us deep. Baylor's already shown a tendency to allow that to happen on occasion. So you have to scheme that out of the game immediately. TCU will adjust and be able to get stuff underneath, but then it's about coming and creating consistent long field drives. And that's not what TCU necessarily wants to do. Baylor has to force them into those situations. I mean, Utah is a solid defense. They regardless of what happening offensively, but they held TCU to 13 points. And I'm not expecting Baylor to do that by any means, but there is a path there that has it. They can have that opportunity. Being able to score offensively, that's what I want to talk now about. Baylor's offense against their defense can really help them in this game. If Baylor can run the football against TCU, and they've shown a tendency to allow explosive plays rushing the football, that's going to control TCU's offense. You're not going to go out there and win time of possession, even though TCU doesn't really worry about time of possession either. But Baylor has to have the ability to control the clock when needed, just like they did against Oklahoma State, just like they did against Texas Tech. And TCU, by no stretch of the imagination, is that much better than either of those teams. Well, I say that back. Oklahoma State's terrible stopping the run. Texas Tech's a better comparison, and Baylor's able to find success. They have to run. If they can run for 200 yards in this game, I think they win this game pretty, not easily, but comfortably. That's going to be the key, because TCU has shown they can take away the run when they need to. If you approach that 200-yard mark, I think they have to feel pretty good about Baylor's offense in this game and then controlling what TCU does offensively, because they're not on the field.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned TCU's defense, much better against the pass. They're third in the Big 12 in passing yards allowed per game. Yeah. That's kind of bared out. You kind of look at it and go, okay, yeah, I think they're pretty good against the pass. Again, I don't think they've been challenged by really good passing teams. And I think they're going to get, like we've mentioned, Baylor kind of having a different challenge this week than they've had this season. Sort of, Colorado's in there. I would say Iowa State with their receivers posed a similar challenge. They could also run the ball, but I don't think TCU's really seen a passing attack like kind of what Baylor can bring to the table. And certainly not a team that has as much balance as Baylor has shown, especially over the last 2 weeks. And I think that's a pretty interesting key to this game. TCU is 14th in run defense in the Big 12. They allow 4.1 yards per carry. You mentioned Oklahoma State. So just for context, Oklahoma State is last in the Big 12, giving up 251 yards per game on the ground. That's astronomical. You kind of come back into the surface a little bit. Iowa State's actually 15th in run defense, which is pretty crazy, as Baylor kind of struggled against them in the run game. And then TCU is sitting there at 14th. Texas Tech is up at 11th, and Colorado is 10th. So it's kind of interesting because Baylor didn't run the ball well against Iowa State. Baylor didn't run the ball particularly well against Colorado outside of Sawyer's run. I just think that is interesting. I think off of the bye week, though, Baylor has shown that they've gotten better in that area. And I'm curious how much it gets tested, because I do think this matchup, kind of like the Oklahoma State one, to a certain extent. Oklahoma State's linebackers aren't as good as TCU's. I think that's going to be kind of an area that's a little bit different. I also think TCU's talent, once again, I think is another step up from what they saw against Oklahoma State and Tech along the defensive front. Their problem is they don't have depth. Like once their starters are kind of off the field and they're rolling in that next rotation, it is not the same as their top rotation. So if those guys get tired, get worn down, that's where, if you keep chipping away, that's where you start having success in creating those explosives. Baylor needs their offensive linemen to be able to get to that second level, and need the running backs to be able to make a linebacker miss in the hole as well. That's going to be a huge key, because I do think, like you said, Baylor's going to need to run the ball in this game. I don't think they're just going to be able to drop back and feel comfortable throwing the football 40 times in this game. They are going to want to be balanced and then take their shots when they're available, kind of like they have the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, you look at that, TCU's opponents throwing the football, their rankings across the board. Texas Tech was 19th. After that, 56, 61, 73, 95, 106, 117, and 126. So that's their passing national ranking. So in terms of overall passing yards per game, you have 2-3 inside the top 60, basically. Baylor's 61 in that group, and they're number 3 in terms of passing yards per game on that list of TCU opponents. After that, TCU's face Utah, Kansas, UCF, Stanford, Houston. They don't want to throw the football that much. Or if they try to, they're not very good at it. So we don't really know a ton about TCU's secondary yet. I think they're okay until we know more in this game. Texas Tech and SMU, Texas Tech had plenty of success when they did throw the football against them. It's consistent, just a Texas Tech offense. So I'm curious how that goes. And then you look at the rushing opponents that they've played, a step up. UCF, Kansas, SMU, all top 25 rushing offenses in the country, just raw statistical numbers. Outside of that, it's okay. Texas Tech's a pretty good rushing offense at number 55. Behind there, Utah, Houston, and Stanford, outside the top 75 in total statistics. So it's an interesting conundrum of who they face when you're trying to compare what Baylor does to them, because Baylor has shown the ability to be balanced. if you're going to take something away, we can flip the script and we can throw the football. So they're not going to be able to. It's a lot like Baylor and against Iowa State, right? Like, what are you going to take away defensively? Baylor chose to just play it straight up, and they got burned all over the field. I don't think TCU is going to be able to do that in this game, and I'm curious what game plan they come out with to start this game defensively. They're giving up explosive plays on the ground, not a ton of them, but enough of them that it makes you feel pretty good about Baylor's offense rushing the football. But yeah, man, like they turnover wise, they do a decent job. Where's the number right here? They got 14. They have 3 interceptions against Power 5 opponents. That's 14th in the Big 12. They've recovered 3 fumbles, which is 6th in the Big 12 against Power 5 opponents. Don't do a ton, and that's really the root cause of their losses, as we were just discussing. Their turnover margin, they're giving it up a ton. Defensively, they're not forcing a ton. So if Baylor can protect the football, run the football, and be balanced, I think that's obviously the route to success in this game.
Right. And a couple other areas that kind of have my attention a little bit. TCU is 14th in the Big 12 in third down conversion rate as a defense. So when they're facing Baylor, who isn't great on third down, I think Baylor's 12th in the Big 12 in third down conversions. They're going to have a really nice matchup there on third down. A lot of that is because they're giving up a ton of third and shorts, because they are giving up, run plays. They're giving you opportunities to move the chains. Texas Tech ran 88 plays against TCU. That's a lot of plays. The closest to that was 76 by SMU against TCU. So that game is kind of an outlier, and also speaks to why they gave up 438 yards. It's really tough to not give up that level of yards when you're giving up 88 plays ran on you. That's really, really difficult of an ask. And part of that, comes down to turnovers, even though both teams turned it over plenty in that matchup. I'll also say, we've talked about it the past 2 weeks. Texas Tech and Oklahoma State, especially Texas Tech, terrible at creating havoc plays, especially sacks. And then you look at Oklahoma State, they're kind of middle of the pack. TCU is just kind of one more step up, right, as far as their ability to create sacks, create tackles for loss. Not a huge step, but there is another step up there. And as we know, Baylor's done a great job at avoiding negative plays over these last 2 weeks. I think they will be challenged a little bit more in that regard. And again, I think that just speaks to the fact that TCU does have individual guys who can make plays and get into the backfield and create some havoc. That's going to be something to watch. We know Baylor's offensive line has improved, but I do think that is an area where if you kind of look back, and if Baylor does lose this game, my guess is that TCU will probably have had 3 or 4 sacks and 6 to 8 tackles for loss would be my guess.
Yeah, so they're TCU right now against Power 5 opponents, averaging 2 sacks per game, which is 4th in the Big 12. Tackles for loss is interesting because of the way they play. They're very aggressive defensively, but they're only 12th in tackles for loss at 4.57. But the potential to get tackles for loss because of how they play is high. So if you're playing into their hands or you're struggling to block, then you're having an issue. Now, Baylor has improved a ton in sacks allowed, tackles for loss allowed, especially compared to last year. But just from the beginning of the season, tackles for loss allowed by Baylor's offensive line, 3.83, which is 4th in the Big 12. That's tackles for loss, 3.83 for 4th in the Big 12. Sacks allowed, 1.33, which is 6th in the Big 12. A lot of that has to do with scheme, but right now Baylor's running backs are just finding those little creases to make plays. And we saw that against Oklahoma State. Those little creases turned into big plays because of their ability to make guys miss at the second level. You want that to continue. I don't think you're going to have as many explosive plays as what Oklahoma State gave up. TCU is much better defense than that. But they're going to have to avoid those plays. And I think they have a confidence right now. I mean, they do have that. And I think that's key to a lot of this. Dave Aranda mentioned that in his press conference on Monday, basically saying, what's the difference in right now? Can you really feel momentum? It's not as much momentum as it is confidence. These guys are excited to go play football right now. That's huge for this game, which should be a good atmosphere. A big game, obviously. You move to above 500 this late in the season. There's a lot to play for, and obviously bowl eligibility later, but it's also a rival in this game, and you want these guys to play at the top of their game. And that Oklahoma State game, truly, man, that – to me, like, you got that monkey off the back, right? Like, you beat Oklahoma State at home. You get that win at home. You've beat Tech. Like, other than this game itself, there's not a lot of, well, we haven't done this in a while. We haven't done that. Like, the last 2 weeks, they've kind of knocked those off the shelf. Like, we've done this now. Now the TCU game is about the TCU game. You hope they come out, play within themselves, and that starts on offense of not allowing TCU to do what they want to do, and that's create havoc plays. That defense, you're going to see if it's an obvious rundown, they're going to try to crush you. Obviously, in sacking the quarterback, same type deal. So you don't want to get in situations that you're playing into their hand. Be smart. Don't take negative plays if you don't have to. Sawyer has to have the ability to get rid of the football, throw it away. Don't let them get turnovers. The interception against Oklahoma State early was bad. He should have just thrown it away. And then he had another one later where he should have just thrown it away. That was almost interception. That would have taken points off the board. So avoid those types of play against this TCU defense and be willing and have the ability to gradually move down the football field against this team. Like take what's given there, and that at home, that's probably the best approach that you can have. You want to have explosive plays, but against this defense, you're playing into their hands if you try to do too much. And at least that's how I see it, from what I've seen from TCU through their first 8 games.
I agree. And I think the thing that I look at, and we'll probably get into it more with keys to these games, but the areas on defense that I look at that are going to be just very important for Baylor, and TCU is just terrible at them, are red zone defense, third down conversion defense. Both of those areas, terrible. Penalties, TCU is one of the most penalized teams in the Big 12 also. That's another area, not great. And so those 3 things I just look at and go, oh, and then turnovers. That's the 4th one. So those 4 right there, I mean, I'm not going to say that speaks to a bad team. I'm not going to go that far because we know what they have on offense, and we know that, football is a weird game. Like some of those stats can be misleading. But I do think in general, there are clear ways that Baylor can really take advantage of the weaknesses that TCU has presented in their first 8 games. And so I think that's kind of those 4 right there are going to be really important. I did want to mention this, Colt, because just like big picture type stuff, this is a huge game for both of these teams, in large part because it's Baylor versus TCU, but also because if you look at their remaining games on their schedules, it's very clear that the winner of this game is going to be set up to finish with a record that I think they could be pretty happy with. When you look at what TCU has left, they got Oklahoma State in Fort Worth. They got Arizona in Fort Worth, and then they get Cincinnati at the end of the year. Cincinnati's a bowl team. The other 2 teams aren't. Like they're set up pretty well to really go on a run if they do end up beating Baylor in this matchup. Then, of course, we know what Baylor's schedule is with West Virginia on the road, Houston on the road, and then Kansas. Houston and Kansas probably won't be vying for bowl games when that game is played. Houston took a step towards that being a possibility, but West Virginia is a tough challenge. Like that's a bowl team on the road in Morgantown. But either way, I just think this is clearly kind of one of those springboard games for both of these teams. And it could be one of those wins that just sets up the table for a lot of success towards the end of the year. And crazy part is TCU only has 2 losses in Big 12 play. So they're not out of it. I mean, if a team starts struggling towards the end of the season, there's a chance they kind of find their way in the Big 12. Find their way in the Big 12 championship picture. We'll see. They got a lot of work to do, got a lot to take advantage of, but this game is vitally important for those reasons as well.
Yeah, rivalry game first and foremost, get the fans re-engaged. So we'll see. We have a lot to preview this week. Offensive and defensive keys later on. We'll do our game picks, player interviews, coach interviews. So make sure you stay tuned. If you don't know already, make sure you know that this is a blackout game. So if you're a Baylor fan, make sure you get your black shirt ready. Obviously, the first official one since 2016. But yeah, it's going to be a great atmosphere. 7 p.m. kick. It's just kind of one of those games that Baylor fans have just been ready to have, and not this self-created momentum game. Like, oh, we got to get back on. Like, this is a legit momentum gaining game. They've had 2 in a row. The momentum's getting there. This game is big for the program. I mean, in general, and they need to win this game, not because it's just TCU, but that does make it a much more great mission to accomplish, because if you beat TCU, it's a rival. You haven't done it in really the last 10 years. I mean, it just has not happened for whatever reason, for a variety of different reasons, close losses, blowout losses in a variety of different ways. I'm really anxious and excited to see this team take the field. So any final thoughts on this is general overview of TCU before we get into the rest of the previews later this week?
It's just also really cool that Baylor is honoring the 2013 and 2014 teams, especially as you're playing against TCU. The blackout games got really famous during that time period. TCU was obviously very relevant during those few seasons. 2014, the most notable, but many people forget 2013, Baylor had a wild win against TCU on the road. So these two teams really battled during those years, two major rivals. That's where this rivalry, I think, took another, it went to another level, right? Because TCU got in the Big 12, and then you kind of started to see these two kind of rise to the top. So it's big for that reason, too. That's big for the Waco community, big for the Baylor community, which obviously a lot of people are very fond of those teams. Those two teams were teams that I got fortunate enough. I was a student when those two teams were playing. So it's got a lot of other stuff to it that I do think makes it very important, very recognizable for the fan base. And I would just encourage fans, find a way to get to this game. I just, if you're going to go to one game all year, this is the one. There's only one more home game left. This is a night game. No excuse for the sun or, the weather, for the stands to look kind of empty late in the game. This should be a game where everyone is very locked in and ready to go, and providing the best atmosphere possible for a game that could be huge for this program from a momentum standpoint.
Absolutely. So, all right, Baylor family, that's going to do it for this episode of Inside Baylor Sports. As always, thanks to each of you for listening. For Grayson Grunhafer, I'm Colt Barber. Have a great Tuesday, and Sick 'em Bears.